in this year's series of Bentham seminars, and just to say that next week Andrew Spooner will be presenting, but this week we have Professor Malcolm Quinn from the University of the Arts London. Malcolm is Professor of Cultural and Political History, and I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, having already done some work on Bentham, produced this book, Utilitarianism and the Art School in 19th century Britain, and about the question of taste and utilitarianism and the Royal Academy and the Victorian Albert Museum and Henry Cole, and I mean it's a great book about the way in which utilitarianism had an impact on the way in which art and fine art was regarded. And Malcolm is continuing to work on Bentham, and his latest piece, which students have read, was that one on Hume and Jeremy Bentham on Liberty of Taste, which compared Bentham's thinking with that of David Hume. Malcolm is sort of taking his work further, and today we have, instead of just sort of talking about that particular paper, he's going to talk on the subject of Jeremy Bentham and middle class taste. And so I'll hand over to Malcolm.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Philip and UCL Bentham Project for the invitation to speak to you today on the subject of Jeremy Bentham and middle class taste. It is a real honour to be here, so thank you, Philip. This talk is mentioned, as Philip mentioned, is based on the article Jeremy Bentham on Liberty of Taste, recently published in History of European Ideas. What I'm going to do today is to turn this article inside out by focusing on a claim that I make at the end of the article, which is that, quote me in the article, Bentham's redescription of taste under the sign of sexuality does not simply provide a contrast with David Hume's account of the social character of taste. It is the indication of a direct conflict between the development of middle-class taste as a singular practice with a broadly social character and an alternative scenario in which taste takes its meaning from a social model of utility. My reference to Bentham's redescription of taste under the sign of sexuality is to the groundbreaking work of UCL Bentham Project in publishing Of Sexual Irregularities and Other Writings on Sexual Morality in 2014. This book includes 3 essays that Bentham wrote between 1814 and 1817. So my claim at the end of that History of European Ideas article was, firstly, that Bentham gives us a new description of taste by including it within a discourse on sexuality. Secondly, that under this new description, taste takes its meaning from a social model of utility. And finally, that the manner in which Bentham deals with taste in the essays on sexuality placed him in direct conflict with middle-class taste as it had developed over the previous century and as it was to develop further in the 19th and 20th century. Insofar as the essays on sexuality exemplify what Philip Schofield has called the, quote, radically democratic implications of Bentham's rejection of an aesthetics that is independent of utility, they stand apart from the concept of taste as a singular practice with a broadly social character. And I think here we get to the core of the business I want to look at today. Perhaps the most radical of these implications is that for Bentham, taste and democracy are at odds with each other. Because the delicacy of sentiment that distinguishes good and bad taste stems from the opportunity to exercise a greater influence on someone else's well-being than that person could exert on yours. In his text on Hume's Virtues of 1828, Bentham claims that delicacy of sentiment institutes social division. Quote Bentham, delicacy is another branch. There is physical and psychological. There is often weakness, avoidance of suffering, pain, from objects that cause no pain to others. So they take the merit to themselves. And why? Because it is the mark of their belonging to the influential classes, the ruling few. Unquote. Bentham's contention that taste was somehow outside democracy is perhaps what accounts for John Stuart Mill's comment in his An Estimate of Bentham's Philosophy of 1838, that Bentham could not bear to hear the phrases good taste and bad taste pronounced in his presence. It is also supported by Bentham's observation in material written for the Constitutional Code in the 1820s that those of the, quote Bentham, democratical section who aspire to the tastes of the rich and powerful are in fact opposing democracy, that they, quote Bentham, act in support of the hostile section against themselves, unquote, and will therefore develop an aversion to contact with the working classes, all those who, quote, cannot afford a clean shirt every day and a suit of clothes every 2 or 3 months. And finally, in compiling this little bit of evidence, in Bowring's edition of Bentham's Deontology, take that as you will, we have this, quote, the democratic refers, or is at least constantly tending, more and more, to refer everything to the standard of utility, to the greatest happiness principle. The aristocratical, as much, as far, and as long as possible, to the standard of taste, constituting itself the arbiter of taste, unquote. So given that I've presented these bits of evidence, it would seem, therefore, that Bentham's absolute distinction between good taste and democracy forecloses on the very idea of middle-class taste. There should be no such thing. At the beginning of the 19th century, it appears that Bentham thought that it was worth floating the idea that standards of taste would be consigned to the dustbin of history, because democracy was embracing the standard of utility. So what the hell happened? Why did Bentham's wish to make aristocratic taste a terminal social practice remain unrealised? Why does an absolute opposition between democracy and good taste now seem such a very odd way to frame an argument about democracy? Why would you do that? I think that the answer to this question has a lot to do with how the distinctions between good and bad taste that, for Bentham, limit and distort our view of the social field to the point where Democrats imitate aristocrats and are repelled by the labouring classes, are also the same distinctions that for Joseph Addison, David Hume, and as I will argue, John Stuart Mill, provide an ethical vantage point that enables us to discover what is worthy of our collective esteem in an unprejudiced, non-arbitrary way that everyone can collectively appreciate and understand. Before Bentham formulated his opposition between good taste and democracy, David Hume had offered a route from aristocratic taste to a taste appropriate to what Hume called the middle station of life, by aligning taste with virtue and giving taste a central role in culture through the exercise of delicate sensibility. In this paper, I want to highlight the role of J.S. Mill in this contest between good taste outside democracy and good taste within democracy, because I think it helps us to understand the difficulty of conceiving of a moral economy that refuses the distinction between good taste and bad taste. J.S. Mill's writing on Bentham and taste also allows us to understand why, in this respect, Mill is the successor of Joseph Addison and David Hume and not Bentham. If Jeremy Bentham aspired to be the terminator of good taste, why did J.S. Mill oppose this termination? This is where I think Bentham's essays on sexuality can help us, by showing how a redescription of taste within a discourse on sexuality can establish terms through which we can mark the ethical boundary that places good taste outside democracy, an ethical boundary that J.S. Mill did not recognise. In order to clarify how I'm using Bentham as a way to conceive of a relationship between taste and democracy, it's important to add that in contemporary discourse on taste, we become accustomed to interpreting the democratic problem of taste, if there is such a problem, as being embodied in the aspiration of the middle classes to see everything aesthetically, in an elitist, quasi-Kantian appreciation of form rather than content. I think that's the dominant view of the democratic problem of taste. While this idea might correctly position the middle classes as cultural omnivores who oppose working class univores, It does not deal with the issue of why middle-class omnivorousness paradoxically demonstrates ethical power over choice, rather than being an indication that someone has let themselves go and is wallowing in the mire of consumption. In a general sense, middle-class taste can be said to have evolved as a mode of social appearance in which status is achieved without noble birth, through learning how to discriminate the decorous and the good in culture from the bad excesses of commercial glut, religious enthusiasm, or idiosyncratic passions. The development of taste as a distinct practice with a broadly social character allowed an emergent middle class to separate the esteem we pay someone because of their character from the esteem that is due to a social rank or title. From this perspective, we defer to the character that is demonstrated in good taste because it is the evidence of an ability to develop autonomy and self-determination within the world of goods, whereas, of course, accidents of noble birth and the vagaries of possession offer no such guarantee. It's about control. The historical development of distinction between good and bad taste, and the contemporary question of whether that development should be seen as ongoing, stalled, or perhaps already concluded, is also addressed in my introduction to a forthcoming edited collection called The Persistence of Taste, which will appear later this year in the Culture, Economy and the Social series published by Routledge. Today, however, my focus is on the opposition between good taste within democracy and good taste outside democracy, and initially on two questions I've already posed. First question: if Bentham aspired to be the terminator of distinctions between good taste and bad taste, why did J.S. Mill oppose this termination? Secondly, why is it that when we examine J.S. Mill's consciousness of taste, as set out in his writings on Bentham's view on taste in The Estimate of Bentham's Philosophy, and his comments on intellectual tastes in his essay on utilitarianism of 1863, why is it then that Mill seems to be the successor of Addison and Hume and not Bentham? It's worth noting in this regard that while Bentham criticises both Addison and Hume's views on taste, neither of Mill's essays addresses the historical development of a practice of taste. Rather, in An Estimate of Bentham's Philosophy, Mill's criticism of Bentham's views on taste is used as evidence of Bentham's shortcomings as an ethicist. Mill claims that Bentham's refusal to countenance discussions of good and bad taste stemmed from the narrow scope of Bentham's ethics, quote Mill, which does not pretend to aid individuals in the formulation of their own character, which recognises no such wish as self-culture, unquote. Mill argues against Bentham's self-imposed ban on discussion of taste, saying that Bentham writes, quote Mill, as if men's likings and dislikings on things in themselves indifferent were not pregnant with the most important inferences as to every point of their character. As if a person's tastes did not show him to be wise or a fool, cultivated or ignorant, gentle or rough, polished or coarse, sensitive or callous, generous or sordid, benevolent or selfish, conscientious or depraved, unquote. And that wise fool thing will crop up later in the essay on utilitarianism. Mill saw Bentham's blindness to the possibility of reading character from taste as having limited the scope of his ethical analysis to the partial and inconsistent evidence obtained from the scrutiny of outward behaviour and worldly circumstances, which Mill saw as only one half of ethics, the other half being formed by self-culture and self-education. Despite his criticisms of Hume's sceptical philosophy elsewhere in An Estimate of Bentham's Philosophy, here J.S. Mill shares Hume's view that the only ethical distinctions that really matter are those that can be established within the limits of our experience. These distinctions are nonetheless accessible through an impartial and reflective survey of character in which virtue and vice can be seen to persist and through which they can be recognised. Mill also agrees with Hume in assuming that value resides in a person's tastes, that is, in their patterns of preference and the character traits that these patterns reveal, but not in the individual objects they choose or reject, which are ethically indifferent. It's about the person, not the object. In Hume's view and Mill's view, a sense of taste and fine discrimination is a kind of informal higher learning that is both valuable in itself and which confers value on our preferences. In this view, taste does not reside in the objects of culture or in expressions of taste, or in a priori cultural rules, but in the social standards of taste established through the cultivation of delicacy of sentiment. These standards of taste guide us in assessing what is worthy of our collective esteem and lead us beyond the myopic view afforded by individual modes of gratification. On these terms, we can see J.S. Mill as someone who, perhaps partly because of his wish to unite the middle and working classes of the 19th century within a democratic sphere of common interests, consistently espoused an enlightened and a progressive form of class consciousness that links taste to character within a moral economy of commercial society. This is the same consciousness that Bentham saw as inimical to utility and democracy. This consciousness of distinctions between good taste and bad taste, crucially, is made manifest through a claim on a socially responsible act of self-representation within the domain of free choice, which, crucially, sacrifices pleasure in the name of better judgment. It is at this juncture, where pleasure is sacrificed to better judgment, that Bentham's essays on sexuality begin to add something new to his views on Addison and Hume in The Rationale of Reward. What is new is what I have defined as a direct conflict with middle-class taste. The reason I think this direct conflict is apparent is that if what we can discern from Addison and Hume to J.S. Mill is the development of taste as a socially responsible act of self-representation within the domain of free choice that sacrifices pleasure in the name of better judgment, then on those terms, we are obliged to ask whether Bentham's redescription of taste under the sign of sexuality, which does not sacrifice pleasure in the name of better judgment, can make any claim on social responsibility. It's taste versus Bentham, folks. So let's look at that question of social responsibility. In Bentham's first essay of Sexual Irregularities or Irregularities of the Sexual Appetite, 1814, he declares bluntly that, quote, taste for any object is an aptitude or disposition to derive pleasure from that object, unquote. To think otherwise, according to Bentham, is to align yourself with the groundless and therefore insatiable antipathy produced by distinctions between good and bad taste. This apparently simple statement places taste within a nascent moral economy of satisfaction. Did it ever come to pass? That contrasts with the moral economy of commercial society developed by Hume and Adam Smith, which is being newly praised in rather odd ways. I can't go into that today. A direct conflict between these two moral economies, one nascent, one well-established, arises because in the manuscripts of Sexual Irregularities, Bentham shows how the kind of passionate attachments that seem to stand in the way of the cultivation of better judgment can defeat prejudice and produce social benefits without any recourse whatsoever to refinement, education, or restraint. This is heresy. In Bentham's view, base desires cannot be educated or refined. Why should they be? But if provided with a means of unfettered expression, they can become socially valued by being offset against harms whose effects they mitigate. The clearest example of this that Bentham provides, which is familiar to all of you, I'm sure, is in his comments on Thomas Malthus, where he suggests that a suppressed aspect of Malthus's reasoning proves the propriety and ethical value of homosexuality as a check on overpopulation. Quote Bentham, though his situation, that is Malthus, in the double character of a clergyman of the established church and an instructor of youth, does not admit of his proposing it or directly advocating it, unquote. Too bad for Malthus. In this way, Bentham argued, a desire without a recognised form of social expression could be given a social meaning and an ethical signification while retaining its condition as an example of passionate attachment between one individual and another. Now we go back to the other side. The route taken to eliminate prejudice in the genealogy of middle-class taste runs in precisely the opposite direction to the one Bentham advocated. From Joseph Addison's essay on taste in The Spectator of 1712, that compares the ability to assess subtle flavours in tea to the ability to discern quality in literature, to David Hume's assertion in his essay of The Standard of Taste in 1757 that preferring the works of John Ogilvy to those of John Milton would indicate a fault in perception equivalent to mistaking a molehill for a mountain, and on to J.S. Mill's account of intellectual taste in his famous remarks on Socrates and the satisfied fool in his essay on utilitarianism, we see an increasing refinement of the description of taste itself, so that by the time, refinement of a refinement, if you like, so that by the time we reach J.S. Mill, taste has become identified with a capacity for impartial judgment that can work across the social field over and above a preference for one thing over another. The main reason that J.S. Mill tells us that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than the fool satisfied is not primarily because Socrates prefers different and better things to the fool. It's worse than that. It's because only Socrates can evaluate whatever it is that the fool is satisfied with. That's crucial. Only Socrates is in the evaluation business. The fool isn't. Mill says, quote Mill, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the equation. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Who's in the judgment business? Not the fool." So, this is not so much a description of two different kinds of people, one of whom is devoted to higher pleasures and the other is satisfied with lower pleasures, but rather of an entire social arrangement in which pleasure and satisfaction can only be judged through the lens of dissatisfaction. The position Mill takes here is definitely not that of the snob or the arriviste, who knows what's good for someone else and who, for that very reason, always comes too late to judgment and is always wrong. It is the apparently more benign and tolerant, but in fact more firmly class-conscious position of someone whose very tolerance gives them a more comprehensive view of the social field than someone else. On these terms, good taste does not have to choose anything at all to demonstrate its ethical power, because good taste is the capacity for judgment, and bad taste is a choice made in the absence of this capacity. We still have a number of terms in current use for these blind choices: kitsch, cheesy, tacky, etc. It's worth noting that all of these terms operate from the point of view of a consciousness of good taste and operate by opposing discriminating judgment to blind choice. Think of your grandma's ornaments for a minute. J.S. Mill's essay on utilitarianism tells us that it's only by means of a more far-sighted view that we can begin to define a relationship between good taste and blind choice, and in this way get a consciousness of our own position within the social field. Quote Mill again, "It may be objected that many who are capable of higher pleasures occasionally under the influence of temptation postpone them to the lower, but this is quite compatible with a full appreciation of the intrinsic superiority of the higher. Men often from infirmity of character make their election of the nearer good, though they know it to be the less valuable. This is the ethics of the omnivore, an ethics that prevents their omnivorousness from appearing as a loss of autonomy and control." I think sociologists have missed this point. A contemporary variant of this view is to be found when we use the phrase guilty pleasure to describe a situation in which we find ourselves enjoying a film, a TV program, think of Made in Chelsea, or a piece of music that we think others may not hold in high regard. There is a contradiction in feeling guilty about your pleasures, because expressing the difference between abandonment and self-control is the very basis of good taste. The person who confesses their guilty pleasures is after the same goal as J.S. Mill. When Mill declares that the pleasures derived from the higher faculties are preferable in kind to other pleasures, his aim is to define a sphere in which his control over choice can be demonstrated through the exercise of sensibility. As Mill puts it, quote, "What is there to decide whether a particular pleasure is worth purchasing at the cost of a particular pain, except the feelings and judgment of the experience?" Sensibility, from Addison to Hume to Mill. The demarcation of this sphere of control by delicate sensibility is at the core of a consciousness of taste that steers a choice between, on the one hand, fixed rules of taste, now dead and gone, that give someone else control over my choices, and on the other, the helpless attachment to objects that is demonstrated in blind choice. As I've suggested, the social ambition of middle-class taste is not so much about the aspiration to see everything aesthetically, Rather, it seeks a greater measure of control over the sphere of choice within commercial society. David Hume makes this point very clear in his essay on the delicacy of taste and passion, of 1742. Hume says, quote, Hume, "The good or ill accidents of life are very little at our disposal, but we are pretty much masters of what books we shall read, what diversions we shall partake of, and what company we shall keep." Lucky us. Sorry, that was me. Quote Hume, "Philosophers have endeavoured to render happiness entirely independent of everything external." Says Hume, "That degree of perfection is impossible to be attained, but every wise man will endeavour to place his happiness on such objects chiefly as depend on himself, and that is not to be attained so much by any other means as by this delicacy of sentiment. When a man is possessed of that talent, he is more happy by what pleases his taste than by what gratifies his appetites, and receives more enjoyment from a poem or a piece of reasoning than the most expensive luxury he can afford. By the most expensive luxury can afford," unquote Hume. The most important point to note here is that the line of demarcation, the difference in kind between the pleasure of reading a book and indulgence in the most expensive luxury you can afford, is obtained by defining a sphere of culture as an idealized sphere of control, within which free choice can be used to demonstrate ethical responsibility. Quote Hume again, "We are pretty much masters what books we shall read, what diversions we shall partake of, and what companies we shall keep." Culture and ethics coincide. The ideal critic of taste is not a philosopher who would separate us from the world, but a person of delicate sensibility who can show us how to live within it. In his treatise, Hume says that if we can listen to our worst enemy and realise he's got a fine singing voice, we can thereby, quote Hume, give praise to what deserves it. That's how we find out what a fine singing voice is, of course. In this way, Hume argues social standards of taste can be established that enable us to do battle with bad interpretations and false critics. Those who would say, but a fine singing voice is this. You can know it isn't. We all know what it is. Bentham, however, thought that Hume offered a means to analyse, this is very important, only the purest elements of social exchange. This is a distorted view of the social field. In turn, this had the effect of interrupting the everyday forms of social transaction through which the expectation of pleasure is secured. As Bentham says of Hume in The Rationale of Reward, this is quote Bentham now, "Even Hume, in spite of his proud and independent philosophy, has yielded to this literary prejudice. By a single piece, says he, the Duke of Buckingham rendered a great service to his age and was a reformer of its taste. In what consisted this important service? He had written a comedy, The Rehearsal, the object of which was to render those theatrical pieces which had been most popular the objects of general distaste. His satire was completely successful, but what was its fruit? The lovers of that species of amusement were deprived of so much pleasure. A multitude of authors, covered with ridicule and contempt, deplored at the same time the loss of their reputation and their bread," unquote Bentham. Here Bentham claims that the pretended delicacy of the practice of taste promoted by Hume, Addison and their ilk, introduces a new form of violence in which audiences are deprived of pleasure and authors are covered with ridicule and contempt. However, in the passage quoted above, it's easy to mistake Bentham's views on Hume, or Hume's views on taste, as a simple advocacy of each to his own taste. In other words, a liberal or indulgent attitude towards personal preferences. However, an advocacy of each to his own taste would not have involved Bentham in a direct conflict with the class consciousness of taste I've been describing, because such rampant individualism could not be the foundation of a utilitarian moral economy that would oppose the moral economy of middle class taste. What the essays on sexuality show is that what Bentham advocated was not a liberal attitude to personal preferences, so much as the avoidance of the by now familiar distinction between judgments of quality and consumer preferences that balance quality against cost, through his emphasis on the social dynamics of pleasure. In Of Sexual Irregularities, Bentham at one point seems to offer a straightforward assertion of the principle of each to his own taste, but his explanation of his reasoning in this instance asserts the ethical value of idiosyncratic appetites over and above an education in taste, without denying that an education in taste may be used to produce specialised knowledge. I'm going to quote a long passage here, but it's quite important to see the way the argument works. Bentham says, "It is not very common for a man to be made to change his opinion, still less common for him to be made to change his taste. To every man that which is his own taste is the best taste. To say that is tautology. To say it is not is self-contradiction. In the case of the fine arts, when the object is of a complex nature, being made to observe this or that circumstance that he had not observed before, this or that feature or defect of defect or excellence which till now had passed unobserved, a man may now and then be made to change his taste. But in the field of appetite or physical appetite, so simple is the object, no place can be found for any such discovery. The man to whom habit has rendered the use of tobacco a source of gratification, whether in the way of snuffing, smoking, or mastication, by nothing that anyone can say to him will he be convinced that that taste of his is a bad taste. Let him see that by taking it he inflicts annoyance on those in whose presence he is taking it. You may make him abstain from it, but never can you make him in his own mind acknowledge it to be a bad taste." Unquote Bentham. Here Bentham outlines the difference between a moral economy that can encompass an empirical variety of behaviour and a moral economy of culture built on distinctions of taste that sacrifices pleasure to better judgment. I think we have to wait to Freud to get to this point again, but I can't discuss that today. The empirical. Bentham offers an implicit challenge to Hume's claim that only taste that is freed from the chains of appetite can carry ethical value. He does this, crucially, without requiring a corresponding challenge to Hume's assertion that critics of taste can assist in the development of the social practice of taste. Bentham's not denying that such a practice can exist and be nurtured. Bentham does not shrink from defining the union of sensibility and complex objects through taste as offering a particular kind of pleasure in the perception of differences. However, he goes on to highlight another difference between the demonstration of self-command through a change in taste and the absence of self-command through the inability to alter one's taste. So here we are with the Millian thing again, the Fool and Socrates. The tobacco smoker may be chained to his habit. He may be a fool in Mill's sense, but he can still refuse to define his habit as bad until he can, quote Bentham, see that by taking it he inflicts annoyance on those in whose presence he's taking it, unquote. That is, when he sees that taking tobacco is contrary to public utility. At this point, any control that others may exert on the tobacco smoker is unrelated to the smoker's choice to purchase tobacco in expectation of pleasure, and also has nothing to do with the discrimination between refined and debased pleasures that is achieved through an education in taste. From this perspective, judgments of taste are opportunities to exert negative pressure on social transactions through which pleasure is secured, and preferences are the reduction of the complex social dynamics of transaction to individual choices. And that's kind of how we see things, I think. Judgments of taste and consumer preferences both function by assigning pleasures to persons. Consumer preferences employ individual calculations of quality against cost. Judgments of taste dissolve mutually pleasurable transactions into distinctions between those persons who have the capacity to discriminate between pleasures and those who choose pleasure as an end in itself. Back to Mill again. The moral economy of taste that Bentham describes in the essays on sexuality directly connects a strictly empirical account of varieties of pleasure to legitimate and useful social ends, while referring to the distinction between this empirical account of pleasure and the groundless and therefore insatiable antipathy produced by the cultural differences between good and bad taste. Democracy versus taste. This nascent moral economy of taste also relates to the business of politics. If it is true, as Bentham claims, that, quote again, taste for any object is an aptitude or disposition to derive pleasure from that object, unquote, this also implies that the limits of vice and virtue are most effectively guarded by liberty of taste without restraint or disguise. In Bentham's view, utility simultaneously redefines the necessity of restraint and eliminates the need for disguise. For Bentham, the only justification for self-denial in matters of taste and sexual behaviour lies in the elimination of social mischief. For this reason, the more openly a government asserts the liberty of tastes, dispositions and proclivities, the more certain should be its guarantee that these practices do not have any socially deleterious effects. Democracy versus taste. In advocating this position, Bentham claims that the practice of government should take account of the expectations of enjoyment and the disposition to derive pleasure that develop through the multiple transactions that take place between social actors, while of course defining these expectations according to a utilitarian principle in which liberty and security are conjoined. Taste, when defined by Bentham as aptitudes to derive pleasure, are already constituted as a social phenomenon that is just defined by utility. Pleasure, unlike pain, cannot be assigned by one person to another or conferred by legislation, but as Bentham says in The Rationale of Reward, pleasure, quote, can be given only by giving the means by which it is purchased, that is to say, a matter of wealth which everyone may employ in his own way, unquote. Here Bentham also gives the example of what he calls the half-civilized practice of rewarding the service of warriors with the favours of women, an example in which pleasures are assigned to persons in a way that denies the transactional nature of pleasure and, for both parties, the dignity of free choice. And I think this is really interesting. If there is a half-civilized practice where warriors are rewarded with the favours of women, this limits the possibilities for pleasure, and crucially, so does the apparently more civilized practice of sacrificing pleasure for better judgment in distinctions between good and bad taste. So who's civilized now? But if we are to accept Bentham's alternative of terminating aristocratic taste and building a democracy without distinctions between good and bad taste, how do we do it? Bentham suggests that the mark of civilization is established and the defeat of prejudice is accomplished when we can approach the question of existence through language, that is, by means of the problem of language usage presented by the names of fictitious entities, that is, abstract terms. To defeat prejudice, unlike Hume, we have to rely on what can only be spoken of as existing in order to establish a truth about what exists. In Bentham's view, the truth of communication, which is that abstract terms are necessary for communication to take place, stands as the truth of both the true entity and the false non-entity. If a communication employing an abstract term could be translated into a statement about bodies, pleasures and pains, it made sense. If not, it was nonsense. For Bentham, the statement that does not deceive is a statement that can be reconstructed or paraphrased in order to disclose the thought that seeks pleasure and avoids pain. Bentham thought that statements about good taste and bad taste prevented this kind of disclosure because they broke the link between taste as an anticipation of pleasure and the pleasure thereby obtained. David Hume, on the other hand, saw language differently, entirely differently. He saw the solution to what he saw as the problem of identity and language through an enhanced critical consciousness, sensibility, that addresses particular difficulties in the exercise of judgment of taste. For Hume, the potential for prejudice inherent in superficial and ill-informed arguments about taste should be augmented by the precision of sensibility that can offer a more profound and complex comparison of the good and the bad in culture. Hume advocates better social habits that can lead us to a more precise and unprejudiced definitions of what is worthy of our esteem and what is not. In contrast, Bentham's wish to make it socially legitimate to seek pleasure and avoid pain allowed problems of identity, language and existence to emerge as part of this process of legitimation. So you begin with the empirical, and if problems of identity crop up, so what? In opposition to the use of phrases such as good taste and bad taste to promote sectional interests was the employment of a productive relationship between real and fictitious entities that enables us, in Bentham's words, to lay aside the old phraseology and invent a new one, unquote, in order to establish a new scope for ethical action. Bentham's 3 essays on sex suggest that discriminating judgments of taste cannot be made free of prejudice because such judgments on what is good and bad perforce reveal their roots in what he called the unreflecting emotion and passion of antipathy, which when aroused by a difference in taste can only be appeased by conformity. Because these judgments have no basis in actual injury or mischief. There's no empirical basis here. And Bentham says, produced by contrariety of opinion or taste, the appetite of vengeance is more difficult to be satiated or appeased than when produced by injury, In the case of contrariety, if appeased at all, it is by manifestation or declaration of conformity that it must be appeased. I.e., if there's no empirical basis, then you either have to conform. There's no argument. It's coercion. Bentham also claims that any contrariety of taste inevitably excites a sentiment of ill will. And Bentham says, neither in the field of opinion nor on the ground of taste is there anywhere the smallest spot in which, by the manifestation of contrariety, ill will is not, and that to an indefinite degree of intensity, capable of being excited. There's no end to this violence. An example of this is provided by Hume in Of the Standard of Taste, where, staying true to his wish to reduce the dissembling power of language in favour of the truths revealed by delicate sensibility, Hume argues that the correct perspective on Homer's Iliad depends on making an allowance for its distance from the cultural mores of his own era as the basis for a judgment of its enduring greatness. Hume argues that this same judgment of Homer's greatness depends on an equally impartial assessment of the want of humanity and decency in the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, in which, argues Hume, the limits of vice and virtue are hard to discern. In Hume's view, his sentiment of displeasure about Homer's rough heroes is a valid basis for an objective judgment that gives focus to the distinction between vice and virtue. The heroes are rough, and they're erring on the side of vice. He thus substantiates his claim that taste, by showing us how to avoid confounding vice with virtue, can establish its own domain of knowledge and its own forms of cultural history, which transcend the integrity of the objects it examines. Taste is on a roll now, it's motoring all by itself. On the one hand, the critic of taste must attend closely to the distinctive characteristics of an object within its own cultural and historical context, without any bias towards the standards of her own era. On the other hand, this same unbiased view, which has marked out the difference between the ancients and the moderns, works a transformation in the cultural authority of Homer, re-establishing this authority on the basis of a moral advantage conferred by the sentiment of displeasure. The innovation of the moderns is the impartial practice of taste, which places Homer in the cultural canon as enduring through the very act of asserting this moral advantage. In stark contrast, when Bentham discusses Homer's Iliad in The Rationale of Reward, it is as a part of an argument as to whether the sublimation of violence in the elite pleasures enjoyed by the few prevents the many from being forced to go to war. Bentham suggests that it does not, claiming that a quiet game of cards is better suited to the purposes of sublimation than adventures in high culture. Quote Bentham, "How much better was this minister, Potemkin, occupied at solitaire, than if, with the Iliad in his hand, he had stirred up with his heart the seeds of those ferocious passions which could only be gratified with tears and blood." Why are our prime ministers educated? While Hume checks the ancient violence of Homer with the modern authority of the practice of taste, Bentham claims that this same practice is founded on the groundless and insatiable antipathy produced by contrariety of taste. The elimination of violence latent in Homer, those rough heroes, requires a better remedy than Hume can supply. Bentham's form of higher civilization is founded on a far more radical denial of the priority of concepts of culture, I'm quoting Roger Scruton here, to classify the world in terms of the appropriate action and the appropriate response, unquote Scruton. Instead, I'm arguing that Bentham's comments on the Iliad show us how he included culture within a broader sphere of social activity, defined as what Paula Rudan, in a very good article she did for History of European Ideas, calls, quote, her the logical and historical space of a set of relationships that affects both the rationalization and the practice of government. In other words, society moves and government should take account of how society moves. Society should not be a thing, as it were, that is invented by government as a sphere of control. It is the ethical value, I claim, of a broader conception of the social field that is introduced by eliminating distinctions between good and bad taste that answers the question I posed at the beginning of this paper. Namely, how does activity which does not sacrifice pleasure in the name of better judgment make a claim on social responsibility? Thank you.
Okay, many thanks indeed. That's a really rich and fascinating paper.